Starbucks is by far the most successful coffee brand in the world. With over $26 billion in revenue and over 35,000 stores globally, Starbucks continues to dominate its competitors year after year. The story of Starbucks is nothing short of inspiring. From its struggling origins in Seattle, Washington, to how it became the billion-dollar business it is today, it's clear that Starbucks has revolutionized what coffee means to us. But how did they do it? To answer that question, we first need to take a look at why Starbucks was created in the first place. Which brings us to 1964. That year, a 22-year-old man named Gordon Boker had just dropped out of college and was taking odd jobs in his hometown of Seattle, Washington to get by. While working long hours at his job, he quickly formed a habit of drinking coffee to get through his shifts. But he soon grew old of the cheap coffee Seattle had to offer. So, once a month, he would drive to Vancouver, Canada and buy loads of coffee beans at a shop called Murchie's, which was well known for roasting and selling their own gourmet coffee beans. And it was during these trips that Gordon discovered his passion for gourmet coffee. He couldn't get over how great coffee tasted when using freshly roasted beans. He was always eager to show many of his friends the pleasure of drinking coffee that was actually good. His friends seemed to agree with him and started placing their own orders for Gordon to fulfill. And at that moment, Gordon thought of a brilliant idea. Why not create a gourmet coffee company of his own? He ran the idea by his ex-college roommate Jerry Baldwin and another one of his friends named Zeev Siegel, and they both loved the idea. And so, the trio got to work. They started by looking up coffee companies in the phone book and planned to reach out to them to learn how to roast their own coffee beans. They eventually located a place that sounded exactly like what they had in mind. A small gourmet coffee company in Berkeley, California called Pete's. The trio called Alfred Pete, the company's owner, and asked him to teach them how to make good coffee. And Alfred was more than happy to arrange a visit. After arriving at his store, the trio was starstruck by Pete's skills. His store was chock full with customers, and they quickly realized that he had a depth of knowledge unparalleled by anyone in the United States. In a matter of weeks, they thoroughly learned how to roast their own gourmet coffee beans and run a successful coffee shop like Pete's. Inspired by Pete's success, the three partners returned to Seattle and found their very first shop's location, a corner storefront near Seattle's famous Pike Place Market. They ended up naming this first store Starbucks, a name inspired by the classic tale Moby Dick. And so, on March 30th, 1971, Starbucks was officially open for business. They sold freshly roasted coffee beans by the bag and gave away free samples to get their name out there. However, these samples would actually be the first of many problems they encountered in their first few years in business. Ongoers complained that their gourmet coffee was over roasted and burned and didn't taste as good as the weak coffee they were used to. Traffic to their store was slow, and in their first 9 months, Starbucks grossed $46,832 in revenue. But after expenses, there wasn't much money left. Despite their underwhelming performance, the trio moved to open a second store. But with no money to their names, they had to solicit money from friends to get their new store up and running. With little hope left in the company, Zeev left Starbucks in 1980 to pursue other interests, and left the two remaining men in charge of their stagnant brand. With sales continuing to flatline, it seemed like Starbucks was on a downward spiral toward bankruptcy. But that would all change thanks to one man named Howard Schultz. At the time, a 28-year-old man named Howard Schultz was leading a team of salespeople for a manufacturing company called Hammerplast. Hammerplast was known for creating many plastic household products, including drip coffee makers. And on an ordinary workday in 1981, Howard discovered that one coffee company in particular was ordering unusually large amounts of their coffee makers, and that company was Starbucks. Driven by his curiosity, Howard felt an incredible urge to visit this company to see what they were all about. And so, he traveled from New York to Seattle to visit Starbucks. And when he first walked into their doors, he instantly realized that they weren't just any ordinary coffee company. After taking a sip from one of their samples, he immediately fell in love with their coffee. And after finishing a sample, he met with the remaining two owners of the company and showed his admiration for their product. So much so that he even expressed an interest in working at Starbucks. He was so struck by the partner's passion for gourmet coffee that he felt inclined to help Starbucks grow in any way he could. And lucky enough for Howard, he would get the chance to do precisely that. In 1982, Howard had the opportunity to pitch the two men over dinner about why he was a good fit for Starbucks. While wearing one of his best suits, he charmed them with his youthful energy and made a great case about why he should work for them. At first, the two men were very hesitant about the idea. But after a lengthy call with Howard, they decided to hire him as Starbucks Director of Retail Operations and Marketing. Excited as can be, Howard quit his old job and moved himself and his family to Seattle. After settling in the city, Gordon took him on a business trip to Milan, Italy, to show him firsthand what a truly authentic experience of gourmet coffee looked like. And Howard didn't know it at the time, but this one business trip would forever change his life. While roaming the streets of Milan, he couldn't help but notice the sheer amount of cafes the city had to offer. And when he went into these cafes, he saw many aspects of them that were completely foreign to America. Instead of selling coffee beans by the bag as Starbucks did, these cafes sold freshly brewed coffee drinks in a fancy restaurant-style way. The baristas would call out customers' orders by their names, and those customers had a genuine connection to the coffee they drank and the experience of enjoying their coffee with a community. Also, these people weren't just drinking any ordinary coffee, but rather drinks that Americans had never heard of, like cappuccinos and lattes. Howard instantly saw a huge opportunity to replicate Milan's coffee experience in the US. He wanted to transform every Starbucks into a third place between work and home, a place for people to share time together outside the home or the office while enjoying Starbucks coffee. When he returned to Seattle, he was ecstatic to share his thoughts with Gordon and Jerry. But his ideas were quickly shut down. The owners didn't want Starbucks to deviate from their traditional business model. They wanted Starbucks to remain strictly a coffee bean seller and not become a cafe serving espressos or cappuccinos. Howard was devastated when he heard their news. Furious at their hesitation, Howard left Starbucks in 1985. But he had a plan, and that plan was to open a cafe of his own. After he left Starbucks, Howard went on a quest to raise $1.6 million to open a shop that replicated the coffee culture he experienced in Italy. Raising this money, however, would prove to be a steep uphill battle. It turned out that most investors weren't sold on the idea of selling $3 coffees when most coffee was 50 cents a cup at the time. Of the 242 investors Howard spoke to, 217 shut him down immediately. But those other 25 people had hope for Howard's vision. He ended up reaching his goal of $1.6 million, and after successfully raising the money, Howard officially opened his brand new cafe, Il Giornale, in a cramped 700 square foot space. Over time, Il Giornale garnered some pretty solid success and quickly became known around town for whipping up fancy espressos, serving ice cream, and playing opera music in the background. With how good his shop was doing, Howard was very eager for the future, but the trajectory of his business would change forever. All thanks to one huge opportunity. One day during a casual conversation, Gordon told Howard they were looking to sell Starbucks for $3.8 million. They had 6 locations at the time, and Howard knew that if he could acquire them, Il Giornale would make a killing off the increased exposure. So, at that very moment, his primary goal changed from growing his cafe to getting his hands on the company he begged to join 4 years prior. But there was a problem. $3.8 million was a ton of money for Howard to get at the time, but thankfully, he had a ton of established connections to investors from initially raising money for his first cafe. And better yet, this time around, more investors were akin to Howard's idea. Eventually, he successfully reached the $3.8 million price tag Gordon had offered. And so, in August of 1987, Il Giornale bought Starbucks, and Howard officially became the company's CEO. Right after Howard bought Starbucks, he ended up removing his Il Giornale branding and made all of his locations into Starbucks. He had big dreams for the future, but what he was about to experience in the next few decades was nothing near what he would have ever expected. Howard's game plan for Starbucks was simple: expand as rapidly as possible while focusing on high quality coffee, creating an inviting atmosphere for customers, and keeping prices low. He knew he had a killer business model in an industry that wasn't even a thing yet: specialty coffee. This new industry offered an enormous opportunity for Starbucks, and Howard was confident that millions of people worldwide would enjoy the specialty experience he created. So all he needed to do was to get as many stores built as quickly as possible. And so, he did exactly that. By the end of 1987, the same year Howard acquired Starbucks, he opened new locations in big cities like Chicago and Vancouver, bringing the total number of locations to 17. As Howard expected, all of these new cities loved his cafe idea, and his stores were booming in popularity. So he kept going. Just 4 years later in 1992, Starbucks offered 165 stores to enjoy their gourmet coffee in, and their revenue was more than $93 million. As Howard's cafe business model kept proving to be successful, he was able to open an official HQ in Seattle and take Starbucks public on the NASDAQ. Doing so raised a fresh $271 million for the company. And as you may have expected, Howard took this money and kept opening stores. By 1994, there were 425. And just 2 short years later, Starbucks cut the ribbon on its 1,000th new location. And by 2000, the world had officially caught on to Starbucks. Howard had created a global operation of more than 3,500 stores that generated $2.2 billion in annual revenue. And to this day, Starbucks is still the international phenomenon it was during the 90s. With over 35,000 stores and over $26 billion in revenue, Starbucks continues to be a dominating force in not just specialty coffee, but coffee in general.